Okay, I'd like to call this meeting to order. Um, First item is, I guess, roll call. We have to do that formally, right? Um, Sergio,
Yes.
Cliff Brown,
Here.
Sadaf Kizmi,
Here.
and I'm here too. Um, First item is we should select a chair for this meeting. That, that shouldn't be me, by the way.
Is
I
is this
So how
move.
do you want to go about that?
the entire group?
Yes,
Okay, so I'm gonna I know Sadaf is already chairing one.
yeah.
I know Bernard that you just said it shouldn't be you. I don't think it should be me. So I think Sergio, it's you by default. So I
And
nominate.
why shouldn't it be you, Cliff? Just curious.
So honestly, I between stuff with advisory and the schools subcommittee that I'm on here with Sadaf. Um,
Okay, you
so
commit.
I can do it. Yeah.
Okay. So Sergio, do you accept the default or not default, but uh, the assignment?
I really think that Cliff would be a better choice here, and this is a combination of Cliff. Help us out here for a minute. Your town meeting activity is on the wane now, right? Most of that stuff is behind you.
Well, so town meeting is in November, right? And the advisory committee is not yet finished what it's doing. And just like last night, not that I want to be spending time on this particular article, but Article 19, which is the 25th Amendment article, has been referred back to my subcommittee. And I'm working with the petitioner to try to come up with a fourth version that might actually get out of our committee. Um, and,
All right,
and so
look, I'll tell you what.
I'm happy to help. And
Yeah, rather than spending time on this, why don't I say yes on a provisional basis, assuming that the rest of the subcommittee members will kind of pitch in where and as needed. And so we'll go from there. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
No, not at all.
And just to
Okay.
flag, that's what other committees have been doing too. There's a chair who kind of runs the meetings, but for example, the other subcommittees have people, rotating who's taking the minutes, rotating who's, assigning different roles and responsibilities. So the chair's role is what you make of it. So that's good.
Yeah, and everyone will help you out, Sergio.
All right. So
And you may not be perfect, but you're perfect for us.
that's both statements are highly dubious. Okay.
Okay.
So
By the way, the first thing you
thought
need to
would
do is
be,
identify someone to take minutes.
well, I thought the meetings were being recorded.
They are, but we do ask someone on the committee to just summarize the meeting at the end of it. And again, minutes need not be detailed. They need to be a description of what was, a general description of what was discussed and any votes that were taken.
So I'm looking for a
do it.
volunteer who would be prepared to perform that function, please.
Yeah, I can do minutes. I just have to leave at 5, so I will take
Okay,
minutes.
so we're going to roll right along. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
So unless the committee has a different perspective, it seemed to me that the first thing we should try to do was to see whether we have some agreement on the topics that we want to focus on. And we had an initial list that Sadaf had prepared, which I will read briefly. The first had to do with the potential for commercial development to help us out. The second had to do with looking at buffers. The third had to do with space utilization, which I understood to be referring to the public schools of Brookline's use. And the fourth was the question of whether we should consider an alternative model to the K-8 high school system that we have, a K-5 middle school or something else. Those were the four that had first come up. And to those, I had added 3 other ideas. One had to do with whether trying to get the school budget book and the town budget book on a common software was worth pursuing. The second had to do with looking at the impacts of inflation on long-term financial decisions, including things like overrides. And the third had to do with the potential of solar, town-owned solar, being helpful to offset town expenditure for electricity. So there are 7 possible topics in no particular order. If I might add one comment on the buffers, it's my opinion, and I hope that others view this like I do, that looking at buffer zone changes is not useful. In all intents and purposes, the entire town is a buffer zone at this point, but rather it may be useful to ask whether the administration at PSB is able to make use of the buffers in ways that might help level the use of the classrooms. Examples would include that we admit Medco students every year in the spring, but they have no resident address in Brookline, so they might be the last to be assigned to a school based on where everyone else has been assigned. These are some examples that prior superintendents had learned and were taking advantage of, and I just don't know if that institutional knowledge has been lost. Are there any comments on that one for the buffer question?
I think Sadat had her
Sadat
hand
had her
up
hand up,
first.
Yeah, I have a problem which I can't solve, so you guys are going to have to speak up, but go ahead, Sadat.
Yeah, so I raised it earlier before you went into the buffer question. So Cliff, if you have a response to the buffer piece specifically, why don't you go first? I had some additional items that I think we should consider as a group.
Yeah, I guess a couple of things. One, I'd like to understand why, in more detail, why you don't think it would be useful to at least go back and understand how buffer zones would be drawn today, given the population dispersion. I don't personally believe that the town as a whole is a buffer zone. I think there are limits to the way that the buffer zones can be employed. And with regard to the comment about Metco, you're talking about approximately 25 to 30 kids each year, because the others are already placed.
That's my
And
understanding.
so, yeah, and it's not going to be a question of, gee, is there a space over here? It's going to be a question of, is there a space over here where a child is going to be comfortable, with the rest of the student body? So, for example, they're not looking, and they don't want to, nor I think should they, place a minority child in a single classroom by themselves. So they want to make sure they have a reasonable concentration. And so I'm not sure that on the margin, on one given year, that's going to have much impact. Not to say you can't, prove that, but it wouldn't have been the example I would have chosen.
Let me not take your comments, Cliff, as suggesting that we keep buffers on the list. Sadat?
Yeah, I was going to add a couple things. We had mentioned, Sergio, you mentioned from the memo around taking a look at the middle school model as one way of sort of optimizing for space. The other thing that has actually come up in the school subcommittee is sort of along a similar vein, can we consolidate into one less school? And this is a place where we would consider leveraging buffer zones and maybe rewriting, for lack of a better term, or rezoning, evaluating and expanding, shifting buffer zones. That would be obviously a tremendous cost savings if you were able to do that. And this would need to, be considered in the context of existing classroom capacity and be done in partnership with the school's subcommittee. But that is a place where I think looking at the buffer zones in additional detail might be helpful.
Okay, I had distributed earlier the maps of the buffer zones. Sounds like it would be helpful if I sent those around again, unless everybody has them, so I'll try to do that.
And what's the date on that? What's
The
the
most
date?
recent change was 2014, and the baseline work was done in 2012 by Rebecca Stone and Neil Wyshynski. There was a tweak in 2014. And the only thing I've heard recently in talking to the planning department and others is that there may be a small growth spot in Hancock Village. But in looking at the buffer zone, it didn't seem to me that there was anything that was going to be logical there. But I'm very happy to let others look. So let me start by sending those maps out, and people can then look and evaluate. Cliff, to your point on Metco, you know, you can add also, there are other students who don't have addresses in town, like materials fee, same idea, but you're also right that it's incremental, because we're not talking about disrupting an experience that somebody has started, but at the margin only. Okay. And Sadaf, you suggesting the possibility of the consolidation to one less school, which I read that frankly as perhaps a subset of the space utilization question or topic, or are you feeling that it is materially different and should stand on its own?
So I think it is a combination of the space utilization question and also the buffer zone question. I mean, it would really be about rezoning. The reason why the schools subcommittee thought it would be best addressed within this subcommittee is because it is really a longer term question. It's not going to be
Yeah, I get it.
short term, but I agree that there's a lot of intertwining. So, you know, there are a couple of things where the subcommittees will need to work cross committee. But that was the genesis of that recommendation.
Bernard?
Yeah, looking at commercial development opportunities, I mean, that's really long ways off, but maybe short term, relatively short term, we can talk about regulatory reform type measures to make it easier for businesses to come into Brookline, even outside of the big developments like we have at Chestnut Hill. And I guess related to that are there any incentives we can use in order to, increase our commercial base?
So I think these are both, I think, good questions. My own sense, I follow EDAD pretty closely, have been, as you know, I used to be on the planning board. So I have a pretty good feel of where we are on much of these. The sense I have is that we're kind of tapped out following the Chestnut Hill development as far as sites. But the regulatory reform is certainly possible. The question I would have is, what are those controls really available? And perhaps the select board has been discussing this and they have some ideas. Okay, so
Yeah. Let me just add, I mean, my reason for adding those is that we need both long-term ideas,
yeah,
solar power, for example. But we also need to come up with some things we can tell voters. Here's what we're doing to, in a relatively short period of time, reduce the impact of taxes on the taxpayer. In other words, we're going to the voters next year, presumably, and we don't want to tell them that the only ideas we have for long-term changes are way off in the future. Here's something more immediate that will give you some comfort that that the override this year or the next time is not going to be excessively large.
Cliff?
Yeah, so on space utilization on school buildings, I want to make sure that we don't duplicate efforts because this is a topic that's on the school subcommittee as well. So I'm happy to, you know, review it here and talk about it here and get, you know, any assistance. Although Sadaf and I are probably going to be working on that together anyway. But I did want to let people know that that is an issue that we're looking at also.
Well, I think what you say makes sense, and I had a similar reaction. I was waiting for you guys, but if you and Sadaf can feel that it would be both best and most appropriate, including the fact that you've got PSB representatives on those committee, on the school committee, to move those over there, I would have no objection. I don't know how others may feel.
So let me put it like this. That is a topic that I think that I am personally responsible for, or primarily personally responsible for with the schools. I actually had a conversation with Mariah about this yesterday, because I believe that there are a lot of questions and a lot of assumptions that are, you know, being tossed around that there may be simple answers to. We'll find out. And I think that we should start there. But to the extent that there's data that comes out of that that is helpful for this group, you know, we'll share that sooner rather than later, I think.
So as a follow-up, and Chaz, I know you have your hand raised, but just to clarify, Clip, on your point, so you're focused on the school buildings, and
Right.
this, right? So this line item was framed more broadly, and I don't know, you know, you hear these sort of rumblings or questions related to school buildings. I don't know if there are similar questions related to other town buildings, but this item was broader than just the school. So I want to call that out. If we shift it over and say, Cliff, you're tackling this as part of schools, then there remains a question on the town's side potentially.
Does that suggest that it should go to the town group? Let's hear from Chaz.
Um, so it's a good point. I will tell you that in terms of space utilization, there are two sub issues that I think need to be addressed in some fashion. One is there is still no operative agreement between the recreation department and the school department on how the shared space is to be used. And that has so basically, they've been working off of an MOU from 1995 about how to use Sewell Gymnasium, how to use Tappan, how to use the pool, how to use all of these facilities that have now grown and changed, and their use cases have changed quite substantively since 1995. Getting that, you know, being able to have an understanding of where that is and, you know, what the impediments are to finishing that is important. The other aspect of this that is ongoing on our side is that there is going to be an analysis conducted of the Department of Public Works facilities, since they operate a number of facilities outside of Town Hall, some of which people don't even realize are owned by the town. We're going to take a look at those operations and whether or not there is an appetite to consolidate services at the Municipal Service Center or otherwise figure out a more efficient way of utilizing our space. So that effort is ongoing internally in terms of how the town uses its space. The question of how rec and schools share space and share resources is still an open one. So I would, you know, to the extent that that has a place in the broader discussion of how we use space more generally, I think it would be helpful to have an understanding of where, you know, effectively where the sticking points are there so that we can move that along and come to a conclusion on that. And then more broadly, the two kind of outstanding issues that were left over from the town school model subcommittee were I think the committee well and settled the question of whether or not we were going to move off of our current model towards something more close to Arlington. The answer to that ultimately is no. Don't, you know, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. But however, take a look at two areas in particular. One is what are shared expenses and what are shared services. And I think a recommendation from this subcommittee to the broader committee, and ultimately something in the report about it need not be, for example, oh, the following services should be shared, but a timeline for the town and the schools coming together and agreeing to a revised shared services model, I think would be very helpful just in terms of a commitment to the public, similar to what Bernard talked about how we are doing a deep dive into our operations. We are consolidating services where appropriate, and we're separating services where appropriate. If it's more efficient for the schools to be running something on their own, so be it. But to at least have a commitment to a process and a timeline for that, I think would be really helpful. Would be one of the better outputs from the subcommittee to the committee as a whole.
So let's just take one example. I assume, for example, you might be thinking of legal service question.
That's one. I think the most salient one remains public buildings, right? That's the single largest service provider on the school side. It's also a source of friction between the town and the schools. And so I think us knowing that we're not going to solve every problem between the services that are now shared and intertwined, that were outlined in that memo to the prior subcommittee, but at least identifying that these are subjects of further discussion, and that we should be having those discussions in the coming year when we talk about what our future looks like. I think is an important discussion to have, if we're going to go down that path.
I get your point, but I guess I'm probing on your opinion that it belongs in this committee. And I guess your feeling is, yes, it does, rather than being a school town committee.
Yeah, my thought on that is really a matter of what I would call bandwidth, right? On the town committee side, for example, the focus is now very heavily on, effectively checking our assumptions, making sure that we are correct in our assumption that, all right, this is the revenue gap that we have, correct in our assumption that, okay, changes in revenues and expenditures will bring in only so much. All right, and then given what our needs are, here's the delta, here's what a potential override would look like, and this is the recommendation. That's really the heavy focus of that committee right now. And this broader question of shared services, I think, is too high level, given where they're going to wind up.
All right. Understood. Okay, so our current theme was trying to find the topics that this committee feels it wants to look at and focus on. Do we have our list out there? Cliff, I see your hand up.
Chaz might have answered the question, but I think both Sadaf and I were a little surprised at the MOU that has been signed between the town and the schools. It did not seem to be as broad a document as we thought it was going to be. And Chaz, maybe what you're saying is that there needs to be a series of MOUs. And that's fine. I guess it does become a question as to where those conversations are best held. And if things are let's define what future means, right? Okay. So if future means more than 12 months, that's a definition we could use. If MOUs are going to be signed within the next year, then I think it doesn't need to stay here. But it could be at the town school group that has not met in quite a while, could be somewhere else. But I'm trying to understand, what do we mean by the future?
Well, I think, I think it is something that has to, overall, the process of analyzing this and doing the work is going to take more than 12 months. The horizon is really kind of the lifespan of a particular 3-year override, which is why I thought it might live here. because it is going to have longer term impacts and will play out over the course of those next 3 years. I agree that ultimately the implementation of this lives at TSP, at the Town School Partnership. Um, but I think the impetus for it has to come out of this override discussion. I don't think, both the town and the schools are dealing with day in, day out issues constantly. There are operational issues that consume our time and attention. The school team is trying to get its leadership team together. Still, um, we just had an assistant town administrator move on. Um, in the absence of a direction from another body with meaningful authority and accountability and carrying a level of accountability, I worry that this is just going to sit on the back burner forever.
That's fine, Chad. That's fine. You've answered the question. What
Sorry.
assistant town administrators moved on?
Oh, Tiffany Oliva has left us. She has gone
Okay.
back to North Carolina.
That I know. Okay, thank you.
So one
Cliff,
other topic, sorry.
Go ahead.
One other topic that came up when we reviewed the memo, weeks ago, months ago now maybe, is that we talked about early in this process a framework around how we prioritize our expenditures, and that might be something this group tackles, right? So, the sort of the values-based framework that was teed up initially when this committee, the broader committee came together, that could be something that we tackle. How do we do that? How do we look at metrics? How do we sort of circle back? I think some of this has been looked at in the past, maybe through I can't remember the name of the body that looked at it, but Cliff, I think you led this a number of years
All right,
ago.
what are you thinking of? One of the prior override study groups or
But it wasn't the override.
BFAC?
Yes, it was BFAC. That's right.
So that was the 2019, 2020.
Yeah, and I don't know if that was, I don't know if that was part of an official override study committee. But anyways, I know some of it was tackled there. I think some of the open questions coming into this subcommittee or this committee more broadly were around, more of a values-based framework, looking at metrics, sort of circling back, around our budgeting process. So I wanted to throw that out there. It was something that we chatted about briefly in one of our broader committee meetings when we were talking about the memo from 9/18 that covered all of the topics. So that might be something we undertake if we decide to do that. And I apologize, I have to step away for just 1 second.
Well, okay, so we have quite a significant list here, and I think part of the problem is we have very little time and very little personnel, if I can use that term, to go after this. What do we think the best structure is, that each member of this committee take on and sort of spearhead one or more of each of the topics and come back to the group with some initial thoughts and recommendations perhaps, or some drafted something or other as a starting point? Or do other people have a different way of thinking about how to move forward from today's meeting?
So I can say that with regard to what the school group is doing, it's sort of exactly that. We've got a pretty lengthy list of things, and each individual has raised their hand for one or more topics. And there's no set time frame for coming back. It's not like we're going to report every week or do a topic every week, because I don't think that really works. But we don't think that really works. I'm certainly open to anything, but that's what we're doing.
Right. Anyone else have any thoughts on how to structure our work?
I think it's easiest, and sorry, I missed part of that, particularly ringing the doorbell. It was so aggressive that I thought it might be important, and of course it was just a package delivered in the rain. I think it is beneficial to sort of divide things up so that one person sort of carries one piece forward, and then they can sort of work on it, based on their capacity and timeline. And then report back. And I know Cliff kind of summarized how we're doing it in schools. And I think that works just to, so people can work within their capacity.
So I'm going to make the suggestion that we follow that idea, and in particular that the first goal of the next meeting is to look at what we're able to produce and to reevaluate the list of topics, because we may find from this initial evaluation that something is really not worth pursuing, or we may find that it's very exciting. I'm not quite sure which. I'm would like a little bit of feedback just for a moment on the question of the common software for the two budget books. This is something I've brought up a couple of times because I just felt that so many people were struggling with this that I thought it was important to raise it. It may also be impossible. I'm the last person to be knowledgeable about DESI and the requirements that are there and all the kinds of things that I really have no familiarity with. So is this something worth pursuing or not? And I really, in part, asking the question to, I would say to Bernard and to Chaz, because you're struggling with this certainly on the town side and putting that together. But what are your views on this? Is this worth doing something with?
I think like anything, you are scratching a deeper problem, right? When you talk about the budget book, that's one thing. And then you're talking about what are our systems of record? For example, on the town side, we use OpenGov to put our budget book together. We develop our budget through OpenGov. We build it out that way. However, the system of record, the financial system of record that we use is Munis. And that is also the school's financial system of record, Munis. And so that is shared. And then this question of how do we put the budget book together is somewhat different. So I think if the question is there, I think my question to you is, what problem are you trying to solve? Is it that it's difficult to understand the categories of spending and that you'd like the categories of spending to be uniform? Is it that there's less information available on one side or the other? Or is it a question of, is there an inefficiency here? Does the fact that the schools use a different platform and we use OpenGov, is that just a cost issue?
Well, if you're asking me this question, all I can do is to say that I noticed with quite great surprise that when the public schools of Brookline came before the select board to present the budget, and I can't remember who, I think John Van Scoyoc asked, how many FTEs do you have? It required Michael Sandman to step in and say, well, that's a calculation you have to do by hand.
Right.
That's just one example. And we've seen this over and over again. So this is me personally.
Yeah.
I've struggled with the school budget for 35 years. I first encountered it in 1994 and couldn't figure it out then, and I still can't. Maybe that's me. I don't know. On this town side, I found it to be generally transparent, easy to access, easy to get answers to obvious kinds of questions. So, but I don't know whether I'm dealing with something which is impossible.
I think it's an important question. I think the question is, how do we streamline that process? Is there an investment required in order to do that? And I'm just thinking about sort of where it gets tackled. But given, all of the struggles that it seems like the schools have from a Munis standpoint or based on the setup, I think something needs to be rectified in this area. And my question would just be, where is that best to tackle? Where is it best to tackle that piece? And maybe it's as simple as saying, hey, we're going to recommend there's a budget for a consultant to come and make a recommendation or to resolve it. Right? So for example,
I'm really testing the water here as to whether the committee feels this is something we want to keep on the list or not. And then if we want to keep it on the list, one of us is going to wind up spearheading figuring it out. I don't know who that will be, but I'm hoping it would be somebody who has more experience on the school side than I do.
So I a question or two. I'm surprised to hear that the school system is munis, because my understanding has been historically that that's not the system they use, and that the challenge always was building a crosswalk from whatever it was they did do for DESE over to munis.
That's correct.
Right. And so, and the MOU that you actually did just sign, or I believe you just signed, talks about some sort of integration between the financial systems. And maybe we could understand what the thrust of that aspect of the MOU is. I personally think that the school budget book has been reasonably informative in the recent past, but not the very recent past. I don't think there's as much information coming out. That might be because of staffing issues, but the book it's really not very helpful at the moment. I don't know if it's going to get to a point where it can be as transparent as the towns, but I would think if you're going to get everyone on munis, that should be achievable. And so correct me if I'm wrong, Lincoln.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Lincoln.
Yeah, no. So I can provide a little more context on that, Cliff. So to reiterate the point, both the town and the schools use munis as the accounting system of record, right? The question that the schools have raised, and that we've had the conversations with the schools about, is their chart of accounts, and how the annual appropriation from town meeting is represented in their accounts in munis, and how they might like to have it loaded differently. So so there's a certain amount of money loaded into this particular account, but it's within the school's purview if they would instead like it in this account. And rather than doing journal entries back through accounts, to rather have the funds better represented to how at the beginning of the fiscal year the schools are intending to spend that money. So that's the chart of accounts question and the crosswalk question, separate from the budget development question, in which, as Chaz said, two different systems are being used. Does that help clarify somewhat?
Yeah, I guess a little bit. Let me ask you a question. Do other municipalities have the same problems or challenges that Brookline seems to have? I mean, my understanding from prior, CFOs is that the answer is no.
This did come up in an early meeting, and Lincoln, I think you said that basically everybody else in Massachusetts uses munis.
Most school districts and by extension towns do, correct?
Right. So this feels like a solvable problem to me.
Yeah, I mean,
solved it.
Lincoln, let me ask you a very specific question.
Sure.
Let's say we want to carry this forward at least for another week. Who would you ask to spearhead looking into this and framing the issues? Who's the right person? Is it Chaz? Is it you? Is it that we need a collaboration with Dr. Gibbons or somebody on the PSB side?
So I think it's identifying the problem a little bit better, right? So if the concern is using two different systems to build the recommended budget to be approved by town meeting, then I think that's a collaborative question between the finance folks on the town side and Dr. Gibbons. If it's a question of what the schools would like their chart of accounts to look like in the accounting system, ultimately that's a question that we on the town side and the comptroller's office is here to help address. But it's not ultimately the solution, in my opinion, needs to start with the schools, right? Only the school's finance folks and the leadership there can know how they want their chart of accounts to look. So I think it's just making sure and identifying, from my perspective, identifying what in Chaz's words, what is the problem we're trying to solve?
And I will say that for that latter thing, that's what that Munis working group is about, right? It's about us building that relationship across town and schools to ensure that our system of record is our system of record, that the schools are not keeping two sets of books. And again, there's nothing, that sounds nefarious. It's not nefarious. It's just, it's inefficient, but it's not nefarious. The schools
What is
are,
this? I'm sorry, Chad, you're saying there's a Munis working group in place currently?
yes. So one of the things that the new MOU does is establishes a Munis working group. Their membership has been set on both the town and the school side, and we're going to start meeting next month. And we're going to talk about this very issue, which is how do we make Munis truly the system of record for the schools rather than the schools doing the work outside of the system of record and then, as Lincoln said, journaling it in later, figuring out how they make that sync up, and then inevitably encountering, issues where, for example, oh, I thought I had that money in that account, but it turns out I don't. Figuring out, and I will say that Susan and her team have, since she's been here, she really has done a deep dive into her side of the budget. It's now just a question of how does that move into Munis? How does that then ensure that they are not fixing it on the back end, but are actually operating in the system of record?
So I've got another question. If most of the state has a situation where their town side and school side are using the same software to build their budgets, I don't understand why we wouldn't do that, because it seems like it's just the most efficient way to work. And I also, from a policy perspective, Susan's been here, Dr. Gibbons has been here for 2.5 years. My understanding is that she may not be staying after this fiscal year. And to me, the question really is, what would we like it to be, irrespective of the people who are in place right now? Because there was a comment made this summer that Munis hadn't been logged into for over a year.
Yes.
And so there's just something that's not sitting right here.
Yeah, and I do think that's so. There are two questions there. I think in terms of the better integration of Munis, the town and the schools are working towards that. In terms of the integration of the public-facing budget, when the town switched to OpenGov, we did buy licenses for the schools to use, and ultimately the schools decided against it. I do think that's a decision worth revisiting, and maybe the recommendation of this committee is that we revisit that decision, that we look at ensuring that the budget is on both town and school sides is equally as accessible, has access to those pivot tables and breakouts and so forth that OpenGov allows us to do for our budget, that just encourages transparency and puts us on the same platform.
Okay.
Chad, let me ask a procedural question. When does this Munis working group meet next?
I'll need to check my calendar. I'm sorry. It's in November. We're just starting up.
Is it a working group, or is it a public body?
It is a working group. It is not a public body.
I guess what I'm wondering here is, could we, as a committee, suspend our view on this budget integration question and ask instead that it be raised at the Munis working group and we get some initial response back as to interest, feasibility, timeline, costs, or something, which
Yes,
we can
absolutely,
perhaps
absolutely.
incorporate or formalize in our subcommittee. So I'm going to suggest that we do that,
Okay,
which means that I'm kind of assigning this topic, for lack of another willing person, to you, Chaz, and with Lincoln's assistance, perhaps. Does that make sense?
that's fine.
Sure.
Yep,
Okay.
that makes sense to us.
All
Yes.
right. So I'm now looking, we have 15 minutes left before we lose it up. So I'm beginning to want to go back and do the rough assignments that we were talking about. I will advance two of these myself. The first is the solar initiative, and on that point, Alexandra Del Vecchio, our sustainability director, has already called together a meeting, which is taking place tomorrow, to begin to look at this question. And the idea would be that they, with this committee's approval, not acquiescence, but just an initial okay, they would come to us sometime in the next month and kind of lay out what they see as possible. And then this committee would then decide whether this made any sense. And if it does, they would refine their work and it would be incorporated as part of our recommendation. Does this make sense to the committee?
I
I
think
mean, I would add that it makes sense, and the main issue is the narrative that we include in the report.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
is going to come only after they tell us. I mean, it's interesting, but Bernard, to your point earlier, when you were looking for quick results, I'm going to suggest to you that regulatory reform is a much longer time horizon than some solar projects that could be indeed online within a year. So this may be one example where there is something along those lines. I'm not asking the committee to commit to anything other than to listen to a presentation that would be put together by Alexandra and her working team, which is primarily made up of two experts at ZIAP.
Makes sense to me.
Good. Okay. So I'll
I
carry
mean,
that.
I'm just one person, so.
Well, do I hear objections? Maybe that's a better way to put it. Okay. So you're willing to listen. That's it. On the inflation question, I'll do that one as well, and I'll try to put together something for the next meeting where I'll try to suggest to you why I think it may be worthwhile looking at. On the commercial development question, I'm wondering, Bernard, whether you might not be the best person for that. You've kind of got your finger on the pulse. The idea of the regulatory reform is also potentially more at the select board executive frame. And I'm suggesting that you might be able to come back to us with a, I don't know, a short paragraph or two about some ideas that might produce the hoped for result that you are intending, which is presumably to attract more business propositions more quickly and more easily.
Okay, I'll work with the people who know this and come up with something.
Right. I mean, clearly we have some obvious advisory teams like EDAB and members of the planning staff who are, got their fingers on the economic pulse. So we'll do that. Okay. On the buffers question, what we left was that I was going to send around the maps for the committee to evaluate, and then we would discuss at the next meeting what next steps there might be. On the space utilization topic, which has some variations around it, but I'm wondering whether we should ask Cliff and Sadaf to try to formulate some framework on that one. What do you guys think?
Well, I certainly can circulate what it is we're thinking of doing
Yeah,
at the school,
that would be a starting point, right?
and can
And
see it.
particularly looking for things that you think that for some reason our futures committee should investigate. And there are these sort of wrinkles that come out of that, right? The consolidation that Sadaf mentioned of the possibility of eliminating 1K8. I don't know where that fits exactly. And there's the alternative model of the K5 middle school, high school question as well. I don't know where that.
So I don't think the middle school K5 situation has anything to do with current space utilization.
Okay.
Because it's a completely different model. Some of the buildings we have would have to be converted to middle schools. You know, it's completely different.
But what about the consolidation question of eliminating one school potentially? Does that?
Well, I think the consolidation question is more a function of what the maps might tell us. And by the way, on the maps, you know, getting what is there from 2014 is fine, but you know, if you're thinking about potential change in buffer zones, you really need to know what the current population dispersion in town is, and to the extent that things haven't changed, and maybe that's what Kara is saying, things haven't changed sufficiently.
That is exactly what the Kara was reporting, with the exception possibly of parts of Hancock Village, which have seen some significant addition of units. But otherwise, there has been addition, but it's pretty flat when you look around town.
Well,
and they've looked
then
at this question.
Then I think what I personally would suggest is having a conversation with Kara and seeing if we can get that map updated with current, and what I mean updated is showing people what 2014 population numbers were versus 2020 or 2023, whatever the most recent date is.
We have ACS data from 24.
Okay, so because one of the things that I think the overall committee needs to be able to do is to be anticipating questions that people are going to ask and giving them information that can answer those questions. So for example, my reaction was, how can you rely on 2014 data?
No, I get it. But the 2014 data is not data, it's a map.
Right.
That's
well, but it's
I
based
get your
on,
point.
based on that data, it's based on census data.
I get your point. And okay, I can work on that. So it leaves us with this question, for example, who's going to look at the alternative model, the K5 middle school model question? There are a couple of communities that made this conversion in this century. One of them is Belmont.
Cambridge
Was about
maybe 12 years ago, 15 years ago as well. Cambridge.
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know, does anyone else anecdotally know of any other community that has done it recently?
I don't. I can spend some time thinking about this one and how we might do this.
I would think people on the school committee should know it. You know, and I think the challenge with this topic is going to be whether or not the people around this table or on the screen have the expertise to actually do some sort of evaluation beyond talking about what the costs were from, you know, for another community to make the switch, and maybe talking to people to see whether or not it, after a period of time, it makes sense to them. Because there's going to be an investment to do this.
Right.
Huge.
You know, it's a big upfront cost.
And time, both.
But then the other question is, how would this committee, subcommittee, or the overall committee actually incorporate any conclusions about this in a memo, in a report, without involving the schools in that discussion? Because
that's really, you're leading to the point I was about to make, which is I'm really wondering whether this kind of an initiative really belongs with the school committee.
So the question is, that it probably does. It's more, I think, does the overall committee feel that it is important enough an evaluation to be undertaken and the rationale for doing that. I think, using the report as a way to influence the school committee to do things is an objective, even if we're not the ones to actually carry out the work. And we are getting pushback, on school topics generally, because people are saying, that's really not your business, right? And I think we need to respect that where it's appropriate, but also use whatever mechanism we feel is appropriate to influence the direction.
Okay.
So actually, let me chime in here on something quick. So the first is that Val was actually supposed to be here for this. I mean, I don't know if she responded in the affirmative, but she's part of this subcommittee.
Correct.
I think that's, unfortunately, it's unfortunate that she's not here, because I think that I agree this is something that we would want to work with the schools on. I didn't see this topic, but although it has been raised, it was raised by Susan in one of our early meetings. It's been raised by other community members. I think it's come up in conversations, Cliff, you've had with school committee members. I know it's come up in some of my conversations as well. I didn't see this analysis or anything we pursue here as a full analysis of this magnitude. I mean, obviously this is like a 18-month, 24-month study that would be done by a firm that has expertise in this area. My thought was that this or something else could be included in the report as, here are some options that the schools might undertake as you think about longer term cost structure, given the percentage of cost is so dramatically driven by headcount, and just the mechanics of the budget over time means that it, to be in a different place from an override point of view, you would actually need to rethink the cost structure. So that was sort of the impetus behind this, to make a recommendation, say, here might be something we want to pursue as a study. And I think that in order to make that type of recommendation, you could do, maybe I'm oversimplifying this because I have a tendency to oversimplify, but do some baseline analysis to say, okay, well, at steady state, right, this is what it might look like if you were to trim down, then how resources are allocated, or hiring and sort of other things, or maybe some benefits from an academic point of view. And we recommend this is worth studying, type of thing was what I had in mind, which felt like a more reasonable thing to undertake for this committee. So just I wanted to.
I think that's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Now we had the shared service model question, essentially, that Chaz had talked about as a topic. Who, how, or what? You've got a working group on that also, is that right, Chaz?
No, I mean, Town School Partnership is supposed to be handling that. I think realistically, the people who should be talking about that are Val and Bernard.
Okay. So we can assign Bernard to our half of that, and we would then look for a partner on the school side, and perhaps Val would be the obvious choice.
Yeah, I think between the two of them, that's the discussion that needs to happen, basically at the chair to chair level. All right, we got to do this. We got to at least have this conversation. What does the timeline look like?
Okay. I think we've now sort of assigned.
By the way, could you tell me what we're talking about? My computer went out for a second.
That's okay. No, the shared services model and
okay, I got everything else. Yeah.
Yeah, we're just saying you're going to do some outreach with Val, I think was the idea, right? So that you've got the chair of the schools and the chair of the town working on this question, which I think makes sense. The last item that Sadat had raised was the question of a value-based approach to the budgeting. And I don't quite know what that actually means. I guess the first thing you have to do is figure out what the values are.
Right.
Now, there have been a number of surveys which have tried to do that.
That's right. I think that's what would be used potentially is, I think given where we are, I think you would leverage the surveys that are done that talk about what this community values, which are relatively recent. And Chaz, keep me honest here. You did share something early in the process that outline the things that the community values, and also some of the things that relative to those values, community thinks we're doing a really good job on as a
Yep.
town.
Yep.
And that's sort of an interesting framework to use as a baseline, and then thinking about how you would utilize, metrics and reviews to really think about whether our expenditures are really, we're getting out of those what we expect. But somebody would need to tackle that.
So how do we get a kind of a one paragraph summary of that for our next session?
So a question I have is, are the folks from the Kennedy School doing anything on that side?
They are, in fact, yes, they're following up on the Polko study. So maybe the response here is we wait for the Kennedy School team to come back with the data that they are putting together on this.
And what's that time frame crudely?
Mid-November. We're meeting with them on Friday, and I will have a firm sense of timeline then.
So tentatively like November 15th?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we're going to put that to you because you're really running that group, as I understand it, Chad. Is that
Correct.
Right?
Yep.
So we'll do that. All right.
Great.
It's now 5:05. We're going to lose Sadaf. What have we missed out of this initial organizational meeting that we should have done? We're going to leave Nicole with the problem of getting us together. I'm going to propose that we look for a week from now to keep up some impetus and try to sort out what's staying and what's dropping. Does that make sense to people?
That makes sense. I think the next thing for the group to do maybe next week is just to look at the timeline and what we need to do by when in order to get to the milestone of having a recommendation for the select board meeting.
So we have some timeline information that you had provided earlier in the memos, and Chaz has provided some as well.
But do we need any of the goals?
Yeah, I think the subcommittee needs to see if that is viable for the subcommittee's group. You're right, there was a proposed timeline, and I think that we could still stick to that. But in order to get to the proposed budgets for sort of mid-December, and then for the broader committee to by early December, it says 12/1, to share tentative recommendations to discuss. The question is just for the next month, what are the internal milestones that we want to tackle?
Yeah, I mean, at best, we're going to have 3 more of these meetings if we're lucky, because we got Thanksgiving to deal with.
Yeah.
So it's very, very tight. I have a request for the town administrator and the chair of the select board to consider, which is, what is so sacred about your initial budget meeting having to take place at the end of December?
So you mean the end of the calendar year in December?
Yeah, I mean, it used to be January 8th, and it got shifted to the last week of December. And I'm
Right.
just asking, could it shift back to January 8th?
So because we have to really put the budget book together, and that takes 4 to 6 weeks, if there's going to be significant shifts, if there's going to be policy concerns that need to come up, we've got to present the forecast by December, especially if we're going to be putting together what's effectively 2 budgets. So with that said, I don't think all the reports need to be written and everything needs to be spoken for by that meeting. But I do think the other 2 committees need to have proposed and pressure tested a number and a structure for any potential override they may want to put on the ballot, so that we can incorporate that into the forecast. That's what needs to happen by December. And then the reports around it, including, what the town should be doing, town at large, meaning town schools should be doing, that can come out in January. It's just the initial baseline numbers got to be December.
Okay. All right. So having tried to push things off and failed, or at least to some degree, let's come back. Nicole, I'm going to request that you make a special effort to try to be sure that we can include Val in our next meeting. I think she's an important player. We need her thoughts and we need her participation. And I'm hoping that everyone else can be a bit accommodating to that, which might mean it's an evening, or it might even mean a weekend. I'm not sure. All right.
Okay.
And I'll try to rough out a little bit after. Sadaf, if you send me your minutes when you can, I'll then try to rough out a crude agenda perhaps for the next meeting as well.
Okay, great. I have to drop. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Anyone have any closing thoughts? I think this has been helpful to begin to see our way forward, but we'll see.
I agree. Very helpful.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Here,
Good
folks.
night.